What's up, y'all? You're watching Union Minded, and today I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about some labor history. Today we're going to talk about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. Happened on March 25th, 1911. You probably never heard about this story if you're not in the labor movement. But this is really what set it all off and really unified working people after this event. If you're new to the channel, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification button so you never miss a video. All right, so now let's jump right on into this. On April 5th, 1911, 400,000 people, Union people to be specific, took to the streets to demonstrate and remember the 7 unidentified victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. The fire took place on March 25th, 1911. But there was some stuff that happened leading up to that fire, which is critical to know. Now, mere weeks later, 1 in 10 New Yorkers were in the streets supporting the Union parade in remembrance of the victims. The feeling was that these girls could not have died in vain. The fire was the deadliest workplace accident in New York's history. When left to its devices, the owner class will sacrifice its workers, who create all profit, at the altar of greed. This event is a clear example of just that. In the summer of 1909, more than 100,000 people worked 6 days a week in the city's garment factories. Many were young women, as young as 10 years old. Immigrants, Italians, Jews, Ukrainians, Polish people. It seems no matter the year, immigrants always are mistreated here in America. As all immigrants know, their willingness to work is the key to the American dream, and these women understood that too. Young ladies thrust into the workforce in order to aid their family's survival. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was one of these garment factories in the heart of Greenwich Village. It was located in the Ash Building on the 8th and 9th floors. A job at Triangle was a desired job at the time. It was a more modern factory with high ceilings and large windows. When compared to the cold, stove-heated, dusty, dark, and dank sweatshops, one can clearly see why it would be a more desirable job. Still, 14 hours a day was how long you had to work, and you only got paid $2 a day before the owners took their cut for the needles and the thread and the electricity that the girls used. If the machine was to malfunction, the girls were blamed for it. 2 dudes that started it, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, they were the greedy owners that caused the tragedy at the factory and never ever faced consequences for it. As per usual, their company mass-produced the hottest style of the day, which was the shirtwaist, and business was booming with sales topping $1 million annually. By 1910, after 20 years on top, the shirtwaist was going out of style, and these unimaginative owners, rather than come up with some new styles, decided to be even harsher to the workers. Profit margins trended down due to their inability to be exceptional. I thought CEOs were the reason companies succeed, but maybe I'm wrong. So what did they do, these titans of the industry? Their brilliant idea was to turn as much cloth into garments as cheaply as possible. It went into mass production. Something else was happening in the summer of 1909. Garment workers all over the city were agitating for shorter hours, better pay, safer shops, and unions. They were fighting for unions in 1909. Harris and Blank were staunchly against it all. Unionization always scares the employers. You can see it today with Starbucks. They do not want workers to have a voice at work. Much like how, like I said, Starbucks is fighting against the baristas. Unions give workers power, after all. Harris and Blank relied on speed and volume to stay ahead of the competition, and they invested in the latest machines. Old pedal pump machines did 34 stitches a minute, but with the new electric machines, the girls were expected to make 3,000 stitches a minute with no mistakes. Women were expected to keep pace with the machines, which was another innovation in fashion, kept them on their toes constantly. It was the rubber soles that the bosses started to wear, because now foremen could sneak up from behind unheard. They were always watching and always keeping the girls stitching with no bathroom breaks and no drinks, no nothing. You want to talk about some harsh working conditions. The conditions were unbearable, and to make it worse, the workers were charged for any mistakes that they made. This meant that you could slave for 14 hours and, due to the mistakes you may have made during the day, walk away without a paycheck. Before they left at the end of the shift, the women were searched to make sure that they didn't take any garments. Harris and Blank were so worried about theft that they ordered that the only secondary exit from the factory remain locked at Washington Place. This was to make sure that all the workers had to go through one door. So the fire exit was locked. The other exit was always kept locked. And at the time, the government didn't really care. We didn't have labor laws at the time. No sanitary laws, no minimum wage, and no maximum hours laws. No one was protecting the women or workers in general. The factory was in the middle of New York, blocks away from wealth and opulence in all directions. Imagine working in terrible conditions, making little to no money, living in a tenement building, while being employed in the middle of the wealthiest New Yorkers, seeing firsthand the American dream while living the American nightmare. On the morning of October 4th, 1909, the workers at the Triangle went on strike. Harris and Blank saw the union movement as a personal attack. Like all exploiters of people, Harris and Blank saw themselves as exceptional humans, deserving of their wealth. They couldn't see how their exploitive behavior robbed the women of their rightful earnings as valuable parts of a successful team. Owners never can see how valuable their workers are. Industry never sees that as the company grows, the value of the CEO actually diminishes. A company with an owner and a helper, for instance, receives a more valuable contribution from the owner than a company with 100 workers and an owner. These 100 workers create all the profit, while the owner does nothing more than extract that profit from the company for himself. For 20 years leading up to 1909, workers were raising the concerns of dangerous jobs, little pay, long hours, etc., but the government wouldn't hear the call for it to referee between the owners and the workers. Winning a union at the shop meant for the Triangle women establishing a contractual relationship with the boss that covers all the workers in that shop with respect to not only the wages that they work for, but also the hours, the conditions, and stops the bosses from being able to abuse the workers. That's what unions do. That's what the collective bargaining agreement does. The owners of the Triangle hired private detective agencies to provide replacement workers and muscle. That's also a common tactic. They hired prostitutes to attack the picketing Triangle workers physically and start fights with them, and then they paid off the local police at the precinct. The police are always against the unions when there's a strike. They always side with the owner class. That's another thing we need to understand. The hired thugs attacked the Triangle workers, and if the workers fought back, the police arrested the workers. Why? Because the police have never been here to serve and protect anything other than the ruling class and capital. That's what they function for. But every day the workers walked the picket line for 6 weeks anyway, inspiring other workers the longer that the Triangle women kept up the strike. More garment workers at other factories started to take notice. Surrounded by the language of America, the girls found inspiration in the ideas of freedom, equality, etc., all the things we hear about. At the end of November 1909, a large union meeting was held to consider an industry-wide strike against the city's 500 factories. Every labor leader begged the garment workers not to strike. Even the president of the AFL, Samuel Gompers, he said, this isn't too surprising, by the way. Many times labor leaders get behind or get blinded by their positions and stop seeing the suffering of their members. But Samuel Gompers was against the strike. He told them you didn't have the money to sustain it. Your families would starve. While leaders were trying to convince members not to strike, a 22-year-old garment worker stepped uninvited to the podium. Her name was Clara Lemlich Shavelson, and she was well known at the meeting. She organized a strike of her own at the shop where she worked a few weeks earlier and was beaten by the owner's hired men. She could still feel the sting of the 6 broken ribs when she got to the podium. She said, "I want to say a few words. I have listened to all of the speakers. I have no more patience for talk. I move that we go on a general strike." When she did this, the whole place erupted. It went nuts. Obviously, the general strike was happening the next morning. The women at the Triangle had spurred the largest work stoppage in New York's history at the time, 20,000 strong. Within 48 hours, 70 small shops gave in to the workers' demands and became union-only shops. Triangle bosses Harris and Blank were pissed at the owners for giving in so quickly, so they formed the Manufacturers Association to fight the workers with an edict of no surrender. The owners kept up the tactics of hiring goons to beat the women and bribing police to look to lock up the women. After a while, police joined in the beating of the women. Ribs were broken, heads were cracked, and the courts jailed the women who were the victims of it all. Everyone was against the labor unions at the time. The establishment, the police, City Hall, they were all against the labor unions at the time. Still, the women kept up the strike, and after a month of nearly out of support money, the city residents no longer paying attention, the newspapers no longer reporting, something remarkable happens. Ann Morgan, the daughter of J.P. Morgan, started to support the strikers. This made the strikes more visible again. They brought it right back into the front lines, or the headlines. Societal ladies started to get recruited to join the picketers, so that caused the cops to stop beating them. By mid-December, the tide was turning in favor of the Triangle women. Newspapers were writing positive stories. On the Triangle owners' recommendation, the owners agreed to higher wages and shorter hours if the strikers would drop their demands for the union-only shops. But the strike leaders said no. They wanted to have a union because that's where the power lied. So the Harris and Blank were ready to give them shorter hours and better pay, but they wanted no union, and the ladies were like, nope, we're not doing that. When they refused, they lost the societal women. It turned off Ann Morgan. She drew the line at fomenting social upheaval. She perceived the strikers as trying to turn the strike into a socialist cause and resigned from the strike committee as a result. She didn't want to change the world. After all, she liked most of it. The workers remained steadfast even though they lost a powerful ally. They never softened their demands, and with the busy season fast approaching, one by one, hundreds of shirtwaist manufacturers accepted their workers' demand for a union. By the middle of February, thousands returned to union-only shops. The Triangle girls not so lucky. They went back to work with concessions on wages and hours, but they had to give up the big issue, which was for a union, which would have been to add safety to the shop. On March 25th, 1911, it was a Saturday, 1 year after the strike of 1909, which ended in February of 1910. It was a short 8-hour workday at the Triangle, and as quitting time approached, I imagine the workers began to think about what their Sunday would look like. But someone dropped a cigarette on the 8th floor of the Ash building and started a fire. As the fire spread, Triangle workers tried to find the quickest exit from the building. They used the stairs, the elevators, and the fire escape. Max Blank and Isaac Harris were up on the 10th floor, and they got a warning from a call. So they made their way to the roof and scrambled across to the building next door. But no one stopped to warn the 200 factory girls working at the sewing machines on the 9th floor. And the flames spread quickly. Smoke entered the 9th floor sewing room, and panic spread. Screams, shouts became the soundtrack. The women and some men tried to find the best way out. The everyday exit, the Green Street exit, was already blocked by the flames. That's how fast the flames spread. Women began to exit through a window and down a fire escape. Others ran to 2 tiny passenger elevators, but only one was working. All while the fire continued to spread ferociously. The elevator took one trip down, filled with girls, and in a moment, girls ran around the floor trying to escape the inferno's heat through cluttered aisles in this combustible factory hellscape. One girl explained how she jumped over a table with 2 machines to escape the flames and watched in horror as older women who couldn't make the jump caught fire and burned to death. Panic was elevated when the fire escape being used collapsed to the street below. It was too many girls on the fire escape, and it pulled away from the masonry. The workers tumbled to their deaths along with the twisted metal of the fire escape. As the factory was filling with smoke, some women went to the windows overlooking Washington Square. A crowd was gathering at the Ash building to look at the pictures in the windows on the 9th floor of women surrounded by flames and smoke. The people shouted for firemen to get ladders up to the women to save them, only to find out that the ladders weren't long enough. They stopped short, and they couldn't get to the girls. The fire spread so fast, consuming everything in its path, including the fibers floating in the air. The only thing the owners did to protect against this type of fire was place a dozen water buckets around the factory floor, a move that was useless at the moment. The workers pushed towards the elevator knowing time was running out. As the last descent of the elevator began, women started jumping into the elevator shaft trying to ride the cable down. The last hope was the Washington Place stairway, which was always locked. This was the secondary exit, and it was locked on March 25th. As the women tried to open the door, they were eaten alive by ferocious flames. Fire was closing in on all sides of the remaining workers. They headed for the last place they could use to try to escape the flames, which is the windows. In less than 5 minutes from when the alarm sounded, the Ash building was surrounded by more than 1,000 eyewitnesses. They watched in horrified disbelief as the firemen raised their useless ladders, which were 30 feet too short to help anyone who was trapped. One girl climbed onto the windowsill. The other workers tried to stop her as she leapt into the smoky air below and onto the concrete beneath it. The women began to embrace each other and leap out of the windows, out of the flames, and into the air and certain death. There was nothing anyone could do to save the women. Firefighters were trying with nets, but the nets were getting torn from their hands. They tried in vain to catch falling women. The last workers burned to death against the windows for all below to see, the screams hauntingly echoing out above the sounds of the fire. When the glass of the windows shattered, it sent bodies falling from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory floor. They were on fire, thudding against the pavement in a heap of smoldering flesh, hair, and garments. The firemen had to extinguish dead bodies that were still on fire once they hit the pavement. The crowd who knew these girls from the strike a year earlier, they remembered the strikers and what they were fighting for, and they saw them all dead on fire in front of their very eyes. It brought the cause of the strike right into hyperfocus. 30 minutes after the initial call, the fire department had it under control. 3 hours later, they were lowering bodies to the ground. The police, many of the same police that beat and abused the strikers a year earlier, had to help in the removal of the bodies of the women. They were so distraught that the crew had to be replaced every hour. The last body was removed just after midnight. By that time, 145 dead was the count. 53 jumped or fell from the windows. 19 jumped into the elevator shaft. 20 or more fell from the fire escape, and at least 50 burned on the factory floor. All but 23 were women, with half of them being teenagers. One woman, a 16-year-old, survived the initial jump but died in the hospital. The next morning, friends and relatives lined up outside a temporary morgue at the East River to try and identify the victims. Many were burned beyond recognition. One man lost all the women in his family, his wife and 2 daughters. The total was 146 who died. Now, while charges of manslaughter were brought against the owners, they, of course, were found not guilty and faded into obscurity with their insurance claim money, because they did get the insurance claim money. But thanks to the fight and sacrifice of the women of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, sweeping labor laws were passed due to pressure applied by an enraged public. Within 2 years, 30 new laws were passed protecting workers. They set standards for minimum wage laws, maximum hours, and workplace conditions, gave teeth to child labor laws, and addressed each and every failure of the Triangle Factory. Sam Gompers said in the aftermath, "Rarely do you get this type of opportunity for reform, but women had to burn first in order for it to happen." The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire was the fire that really sparked the labor movement and led to the work world we are familiar with today, including the 40-hour work week, fire sprinkler systems being mandated, and worker safety laws. Like throughout most of history, we owe such an enormous debt to the women who fought, inspired, and died so that we can have a better work life. We are forever indebted to their sacrifice. To the ladies, don't ever let anyone tell you you don't belong. You guys are the heart and soul of the labor movement, and that's real. I hope you guys enjoyed this very, very long video, but I felt it important to tell the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Its significance to labor and how much changed after that tragedy cannot be overlooked, and it cannot be overstated. Yeah, it was deep. I mean, that's crazy to think that those type of conditions were what people had to work under. It's insane when you think about it. Anyway, my name's Eric. You're watching Union Minded. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like I said, man, if you did, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a video. And remember, the fight's not left and right. It's up and down. It'll take solidarity to win always. Peace.